Strehlow. I'm from the Thünen Institute of Baltic Sea Fisheries in Rostock in Germany, and I'm going to be talking to you about nature contributions to people. And this first picture is actually quite important for you guys to memorize, because this is our #1 target species and iconic species in the Baltic Sea, which is predominantly species poor ocean. And so this is a nice cod that was captured. This picture is quite old. It's maybe 10, 15 years old. And they don't exist anymore. So that's a little bit the problem. This is also why I'm talking about this. And just to give you a little bit more background, why are we interested in these nature contributions to people? This marine recreational fishery sector it's big, it's socially and economically quite important. As I mentioned, the most important target species is gone. Herring, there's 5 stocks, but with the one that is important for us in the Western Baltic also collapsed, so it's also gone or on a low level. And in general, we're anticipating or having a sea that is basically the whole ecological functioning is not working anymore. And I'm also pointing out a little bit because the Baltic Sea is experiencing really strong climate warming effects, and it's a little bit like like a time machine into the future. So hopefully, but I fear a little bit that a lot of coastal regions worldwide will experience a little bit what we are seeing right now. So it has a big impact on the fishing experience, obviously, and on the fishing behavior. And of course, we want to restore everything, but the prospects for stock recovery are 0. So that's something you have to keep in mind, and that's a little bit why we're moving away from looking at the material things and the fish to something else, which is basically something like ecosystem services, but something else here. So our objective was to move away, look at the other benefits that occur during a fishing experience, and we also want to look at some of the subgroups and how they differ in their value orientation. So we chose this nature contributions to people, which is basically old wine in new glasses or whatever you want to call that. But anyhow, it's the approach that is supported by the IPBES, and just in general, you have 3 different groups of items looking for material, nature contributions to people, so basically the food or the fish in our case, regulating factors, and then non-material ones, and I will go into a little bit more detail later on. So we did a telephone survey in Germany and asked people or anglers from a registry that we had of self-recruited license holders, and at the end we had 504 questionnaires. And we did an exploratory factor analysis looking at the data, and then we stuck that into an archetype analysis with using the individual factor scores to look for further differentiation, and also if there is different subgroups in these data. And so first of all, that was just a common question that we have: how important is this angling for your quality of life in the Baltic Sea? And we had a very high approval, so 90% of the people said this is super important for me and for my life. And if you couldn't fish in the Baltic Sea anymore, looking at the poor prospects that we have, would you still come to the Baltic Sea? Yes, many people will still come, so that was actually quite promising. And next, we looked at the ranking of regulating and material factors, and here I'd just like to point out the top one. So obviously, because we're asking anglers, they are aware that the habitat for marine animals is one of the most important ones because they're after fish, so they gave it a high rank. But I would rather stay here with this one. So these are the nature contributions for non-material factors, and this is asking about aesthetics, psychological well-being, care and stewardship, social responsibility, and what you can see is that they had really, really high approval ratings. So you had very high ranking factors. These are the NCPs that ranked by far much more than the material ones, and this is what we looked then in a little bit more detail in the further analysis that we did. So we first conducted this exploratory factor analysis, and that revealed 3 subdimensions. And yeah, the names we gave them are, yeah, they were okay, but that's just what we came up with. So the first one was this everything else, because it basically had items from all kinds of areas, but not relating to the different concepts that are in this NCP framework. And I forgot, I think it's 11, is it 11 constructs? I think it's 22 items and 11 constructs that are in there. So it's quite a lot. Then we had another subdimension we called care and responsibility, because it was basically, or a lot building on the statements regarding social responsibility and one statement regarding stewardship. And then we had this third subdimension, emotional impression. I got to memorize this. And that included each items on psychological well-being, spirituality, and inspiration. And as I mentioned, we took this as this was just a step to take then this data into a archetype analysis, and that basically, I'm really poor in explaining actually what an archetype analysis is, but it's actually looking from the outside into the data. So it's not so much first you're clustering everything, and then it's actually looking at the outliers and clustering them in a different way. And then you come up with these archetypes, and again, these are the names that we choose. So first we have an archetype, the one number 1 here, we called balanced, and it's by far the largest group, as you can see from the numbers. And that basically had, from all 3 subdimensions, they had a quite equal pick of the different factors. And then the pragmatic one, archetype 2, had a lower pick on this third subdimension, which I cannot go back. No, it was emotional impression. That was the one. Yeah. So, huh? Red button is back, okay. Oh, that was the wrong way. Ooh. Oh yeah, that's it. Yeah. So yeah, emotional impression, exactly. And then we had the archetype 3, colors. I don't even know if that's an English word really. You could also call it maybe indifferent, or we call them the bad guys. So this is the group that is basically, they scored like sort of average, but then on the care and stewardship was very low ranked in this group. And then we had the fourth archetype, but again, you have to look at the ends. You can also see it's 34 of this rather, in our sense, larger sample. And then we have the fourth archetype we called care and awe, because it had basically from the 3 subdimensions, it had lots of scores on the care and responsibility and on the emotional impression. And then we looked at, we had all kinds of stuff in this survey, obviously. So we also had statements on environmental protection and pro-environmental behavior to see if that has a influence on the subgroups. We had the whole catch orientation framework in there, and we had some items on centrality. So not quite specialization, but on centrality. And we also looked at if this would also influence somehow. And you can see that this environmental protection and pro-environmental behavior, so these are questions about environmental protection and how much you agree to this, or if you would actually, if you would if you would lower your standard of living in favor of more environmental protection. And then you can see with these 4 archetypes that, for example, here again, this is this colors one. You can see, okay, they certainly do not want to lower their standard of living in favor of environmental protection. But in general, what you can also see is that it doesn't really, there's no real striking, there's not a big influence on these groups and on these archetypes. You don't have to look too much into the numbers. We looked at if the catch orientation of these anglers had an influence on the archetype selection, and equal numbers means there's an insignificance, so there's no significant difference, and you can see that most of the numbers are exactly the same, so it was like, had like zero influence. Quite interesting. So catch orientation, harvest orientation played no role in terms of what archetypes these anglers grouped into. And then, no, that's too far. I thought we had one more. Go back. No. Oh, maybe not. That's a bit odd. Yeah, that's good. I can make that. Anyhow, if it's not mentioned here, centrality and other social demographic factors, for example, had also no influence on deciding whether these anglers grouped into the different archetypes. And I tell you why this is important, or why we looked at this a little bit. So in general, the conclusion is that we had a high preference for these non-material NCPs, in particular landscape aesthetics, psychological well-being, and stewardship. It kind of highlights, of course, the multifaceted nature of angling experiences in the Baltic Sea and probably worldwide. Everybody knows that. Angling is a big experience, not just about catching fish, but also just engaging with nature. For us, the important part is this number 3, because actually it informs environmental and fishery policies to give greater legitimacy for protection and restoration. And this is important in our case because beyond the consideration of material resource, because of the poor prospects. So we still want to restore and protect, despite we know that we're not getting our fish stocks back. So this is for us quite an important way of communicating to actually the managers and the politicians. And it's also for us as researchers kind of changing our perspective, how we're looking at our fisheries, fisheries and recreational fisheries, to be honest, because we just think we have to take this much more ecosystem-centric view and demonstrate how important nature contributions to people are for human well-being. And then important was, again, angler heterogeneity, social demographics all had little association with archetypes and are therefore negligible for operationalization. And I think I have one more slide. Yeah. And I'll start with the bottom one because that's where I ended. So in terms of operationalization, the number of subgroups that you have to reach out to is manageable, and you do not really need a targeted approach because the angling population as such kind of is like a homogeneous body regarding these kind of aspects. And then, as I said, for us, reframing the recreational fishing experience is quite an important one, emphasizing this human-nature relationship, and this is something we're trying to convey then the angling associations and tourism sector to use this as a promotion of keeping the angling in this really deteriorated sea going. And then again, emphasizing the role of these human-nature relationships in policy effort, I think, is key to actually increase the political pressure and restore marine ecosystems, again, despite the poor prospects. Yeah, and with this, thank you very much. And yeah, thank you.
Unfortunately, we have no time for questions.
Aww.
But the good thing is that we are going for
Tea.